Hi, and welcome to another episode of REDtalks.live. I am Nathan Pierce, your host, and our guest today, you might have heard of them, GitHub, Christian Weber. Say hello, Christian.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Christian Weber, Senior Solutions Engineer at GitHub. Happy to be joining today for REDtalks.
Fabulous. Now, it's really cool to have you on board. We talk a lot outside of this show. It's been really cool working with GitHub. People would have seen some of the episodes I've published recently, managing F5 networks devices using GitHub. Fun little thing. Infrastructure as code is what we call that practice. But today, I mean, we've got Christian on so that we're not just going to talk about the kind of work that I've been doing, but just the practice generally at a higher level of infrastructure as code, how people have been using it, the value they get from doing that versus manually managing their stack. And well, who better to get that than someone from GitHub themselves?
Absolutely. There's a whole lot we can sort of talk about in terms of where we see infrastructure as code, but really to kind of take a step back and maybe think about, what GitHub is for the listeners and for the people that are watching this later, to understand what GitHub is. We started 10 years ago as a software development platform that really leveled up what Git itself was. So Git as a source code management platform was really great in terms of distributed software development. It really solved a lot of problems for developers trying to get a hold of an entire code base and working in a distributed environment. So what GitHub did was really level that up and really allow for a layer of collaboration and a connection of disparate communication systems that really hadn't been seen in traditional software development practices. So we've really been honored to become, what's known as sort of the canonical curator of the open source community of more than 30 million developers, 100 million pull requests, merge pull requests that we've seen over the history of GitHub. But really, I think what we've not done as an industry is that we've not really focused on a lot of the infrastructure part, right? So when we think about sort of like the communication aspects and the collaboration benefits, we really thought about it from the traditional software development process, or the software development life cycle. But what we're now seeing in terms of other vendors and other tools out there is really an importance of how I can bring the infrastructure deployment into my software development process. So working with the folks at F5 and what we're going to be doing later next month with Nathan at F5 Agility, I really think it's really helping us begin to sort of drive that conversation around, one, how do I get my infrastructure folk to think like a software developer? And two, how can I level up their skill set from a traditional process of I get a piece of software and then all of a sudden I've got to pump the brakes because my software developer didn't necessarily put all of the security and compliance checks that I have to put into that process. So, a lot of times in the industry, we talk about this sort of like shift left mentality. And what we're really talking about is really getting the security and infrastructure folk not only involved in the software development process, but to almost treat their infrastructure as a software development project itself as well.
I really appreciate that background actually on GitHub. I always just jump in straight to, GitHub's awesome, let's do this. So that was really useful. And I was thinking when you were talking there about how the problem with running infrastructure, not thinking like a software engineer, is missing out on those principles and practices that kind of software engineers have, where everything is done in an extensible way and in a modular way. I mean, they aren't trained and taught to think, oh, just hack that little bit there and then that later is going to kind of bite me. They've got that ingrained to never work that way, to be more scalable and more extensible. And I just find thinking like that and bringing that practice, it's not just the tooling, it's the tooling and that way of operating together, I think is the real value, isn't it?
I absolutely agree. So I think it's a lot of change. A lot of what I talk about when it comes to software development and infrastructure as code is it's really changing the context, or what we're actually seeing is a changing of context of what it actually means to be a software engineer and an infrastructure engineer. So my background was more on the operations side, and really what I see, these tools doing or help enabling is sort of this silo busting between of that invisible wall that exists between the engineers and the operations folk that are deploying infrastructure. Because a lot of times, especially where I came from, which was a lot of financial services and managing a lot of trading environments, we had sort of that invisible silo where we didn't necessarily understand the context or the value proposition of software that we were deploying out into our environments or the servers that we were spinning up. So a lot of times, a lot of the problems that we had in regards to bugs being delivered to production or outages were a lot of times directly related to the software that was being delivered, either from the way that we were deploying it and not following the developer's instructions, or coming from business logic that wasn't necessarily understood correctly, right? So what we found now is when you start thinking about like your infrastructure as a software engineer, what we're actually talking about is, like you said, that scalability and that really that codification or codification, depending on how you pronounce it. I never know. It's a long running. It's like Vim versus Emacs, right? It's a codification of processes to make them repeatable, right? Because one of the biggest things that we think about from an infrastructure as code standpoint is our ability to recover from failure. Because no matter what we do in terms of everything that we engineer into a software development process, bugs will always find themselves in production. And the thing that we need to think about as infrastructure engineers and as software engineers is, oh shit, how do I get my infrastructure back up into a state where my end users can use it? And how do I do that as quickly as possible? So Git itself, there's talks around GitOps and there's talks around, DevOps and et cetera. But really what it's about is treating our infrastructure like source code so that a rollback is not something like rebooting a server and then hoping and praying that it comes back online and our runbooks are running correctly. It's essentially just treating everything as a configuration file, as a template, and we go back into our previous state without relying on the failure state for our means of recovery. And I think what that really does is really brings in that collaboration and that context, right? Because a lot of times the problems that I had in my previous environments coming from financial services is when we would have downtime and we were going through that stand-up afterwards or I can't remember the term now, but we'd have a discussion around why things failed, right? And a lot of times we wouldn't have the developers in the room while we were doing this with our business folk. And so a lot of times we would understand like an outage. If a binary fails because we got arbitrary information back from an exchange that we weren't expecting, we could see that string that was being passed to the binary that caused it to segfault. But if we didn't have our engineers in the room to have a conversation around that, then a lot of times we were just stuck repeating repeating ourselves and going through cycles where we're not necessarily on the same page. So a lot of times, what I talk about is it's building collaboration, but at the same time, in a perfect world scenario, it's like building a community within your organization. Because at the end of the day, we want to write better software so we can be happier at work and also spend less time doing things like being on call and having to rely on work itself, right?
Yeah, there was a statement you threw down there that I immediately wrote down. I was like, I'm totally going to write that in the article that this video is getting embedded in. And that was recovering without relying on the failure state as the start. That is so important. And everybody that I've talked to, everybody I've shown the GitHub webhook integration to, has immediately picked up on that when you revoke a change and you roll back to the previous state. At the moment they see I'm not reverse playing commands that were wrong, those commands never existed. I am existing in the state where I was before. And the amount of people that have said to me after giving a talk about kind of that solution, they come up to afterwards and say, you'd be amazed how often that when we have an outage, it's while quickly trying to fix that outage under the pressure of a production outage that we end up causing the catastrophic outage. The far worse state. And it's like, and everybody seems to tell me that same story, that it's while fixing the small problem that I create the epic problem.
Right. It's almost like that it's almost sort of like an ethereal place between stateless architecture and stateful architecture, right? And what we're thinking about, like if you think about it from a simplistic standpoint, I'll think about an outage that I had, 5 or 6 years ago, where essentially I had an adapter that connected to an exchange and trades were replayed through that. And one of the changes that I did through configuration management, which we had done, it was all timestamped configuration files, was essentially just updating an IP address, right? And I messed that up. And instead of, if we think about like if we think about traditional like non-configuration management or non-treating that as code, essentially what I had to go in there and do was update the configuration file to what I thought was the correct IP address, bounce the server, and then wait for incoming messages from the exchange to tell me I was in a good state. Now, that's fine if I'd entered the IP address correctly the second time or the third time, but it took me several times because the runbooks that I had were out of date, right? So rather than spending my time trying to figure out what times 2, 3, and 4 were to get me to my correct state, what would have been easier is if I had treated my source code like a Git repository. What I could have done is just essentially done like a git reset head -1 and then go back to my previous state without having to manually key in and restart a server, right? So it's not necessarily stateless architecture, because I think that scares a lot of people, including myself. But it's really getting to that point where rollback is trivial, because I think one of the worst things that we can do as an industry is really rely on sort of that domain expertise with the individual. And when you go into a process that's non-codified, you really start kind of what Gene Kim calls like the DevOps rock stars, right? Where you're reliant on these people for knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge is really great for the individual, but it also kind of sucks because sometimes you have to be woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning to pass on that knowledge. Now, from an enterprise organization standpoint, what you're really trying to do is decrease the amount of tribal knowledge within your organization so that when outages like that happen, they become almost worthless in the sense that the amount of downtime that I'm contributing to my company is just a minuscule amount. Meaning that if a reset takes me 30 seconds via like a git reset versus an infrastructure engineer trying to guess what the new IP addresses and ports are within that exchange, we're talking seconds versus minutes to 15 minutes of downtime, right, from that kind of process.
Yeah, and you're not having to wait for the architect who actually committed that change to come back from lunch or whatever meeting they're in. You can just straight up be like, well, I don't know what it was, but I know the known good state was whatever happened before then.
Exactly.
Like you just said, reducing the kind of tribal knowledge that's required of certain people. And yeah, that's a good bit of advice right there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is, things that I talk about, especially when we're more into the infrastructure as code space. I think a lot of the things that we hear in terms of fear is that, the infrastructure as code methodology and this ethos is more of a way to automate infrastructure folks out of jobs, right? And in my experience, that's not what I've seen. What I've actually seen a lot happen in Fortune 100 and Fortune 50 and even Fortune 5 organizations is that essentially skill sets get realigned, right? So if you are a developer that has worked on traditional legacy mainframe systems and you've been sort of the infrastructure guy for that, well, that's great. You're still going to maintain those systems because a lot of those systems aren't necessarily have been able to work in these modern work sets, so you'll still be able to do that. But hey, by the way, we can level up your way that you're contributing to this organization by getting you on board. I've never met a human being that doesn't enjoy context of the bigger picture of why they're working on something. I think humans in general like to understand what they're working on and like to sort of like see what the bigger meaning is in terms of what they're contributing to. Now, whether that's in their personal life or in their work life, it doesn't matter. When you understand context and you understand what you're delivering, you really take pride in your work from there.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, I like the way you just put that. I mean, this idea that you're losing out and being replaced. I've never been more busy than when people started saying, I need to work out how to put your stuff in this continuous deployment tool chain. And it's way cooler because I get the context of where requests were coming from. Like when you worked in the silo where you were just at the end of a ticketing system, this needs to be done, and you would plot away and do your bit. It's really easy, to just totally just not care.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
That ticket system's endless. Doesn't matter if you work 20% harder one day, there's still tickets tomorrow. So why would I give a damn about what I'm doing? Whereas when you get that bigger picture, when you're part of the system instead of the individual contributor to a CLI, well, actually, then that's really cool because there is the continuous improvement that you can keep applying and keep improving and making the system more robust.
Well, and I think it also starts uncovering the things that you don't know, right? If you're a security engineer that is working on a Cisco iOS route all day long, you may not understand the way that I'm getting a little double speaking there. That's okay. So you may not understand the way that a developer is writing their configuration files that are then interacting with your router, right? So once you actually start becoming a part of that software development process and you look at the pull request and you look at the YAML file and how the developer is putting this all together, you can start understanding how that process is being delivered to you at the end of the day. And it also helps you automate a lot of your processes, because I know at the end of the day, I don't like when I was in production, when I'm working on production systems, and thankfully I haven't had to do it in several years. The worst parts of my day were having to do the rote tasks that I had to do every single day, whether that was an audit, whether that was checking my monitoring, whatever. That was the most boring part of my day. The most challenging, the most interesting parts of my day were being able to understand the context of what I was doing and working across many parts of the business. Now you can say that's a personal preference, but we still like to be, we're human beings. We like to be challenged.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with that. It's a hell of a lot of fun just looking at things from a slightly different angle. I personally can't handle just doing it the same way every day, all day long. Being stuck on the same CLI, implementing the same thing. And I don't want the pressure of that, having to support it, or when something goes wrong and someone tells me that there's an outage and I don't have the context of the service that was deployed. I only have the context of my world. How am I meant to be good at troubleshooting that? What am I taking a packet trace of? I don't even know. And working in the silo guarantees that kind of isolation and kind of having to look at everything through a tiny lens, part of a system, which is much easier to grok, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, so two things on that. So one of the books that I read about a few months ago was a book called The Silo Effect, and you can look it up on Amazon. But it essentially talks about the business implications of what it means to have silos across your business. Right now, there's a lot of scary things that they talk about in that book. One of them being the silo effect that happened with UBS and with the bank. UBS, the bank in Switzerland, that suffered tremendously from the crash about 10 years ago. But even from a non-technical standpoint, it shows you the cultural problems that can occur from having those silos. And then secondly, to bring it back in terms of misconceptions around infrastructure as code, and like you said, those silos, a lot of times when enterprise IT organizations are looking at this and they're saying, hey, I'm going to start looking at Terraform, I'm starting to look at I'm starting to look at the HashiCorp suite of products, or I'm looking at CloudFormation, and I really want to have this sort of process. I think the first thing that happens is a lot of times, in terms of the people that run these projects at first, tend to be the software engineers. And then what happens is they start running their Terraform templates directly in the repository, and that's where you start seeing the infrastructure as code coming up. That's certainly one way to work and one way to deploy your infrastructure, and that's certainly what I recommend when you're trying to deploy to your development environments and maybe even your QA and UAT to get business sign-off quickly as possible. But the other way of working in terms of workflow and managing many servers within the scope of an entire organization is you almost take that organization of repo model in GitHub and start applying that to the rest of your infrastructure. So maybe one org represents a department or a business unit within your organization, and then every repository can then represent either a node within your infrastructure or several servers from within there. Because then what happens is then not only do you start delineating the processes between there, but then you again start moving into that, I need to start treating this like a project, right? And not just I don't need to treat infrastructure just as code, but I need to treat it as a project. Meaning, if I want to start doing like some sort of agile development around software deployment or software server deployments, then I can start doing that with collaboration tools. And then I can start integrating that into things like Jira and Jenkins. And so that I can start getting that the benefits of continuous integration, meaning, traditionally a unit test in software development, maybe we'll test a function within my code and make sure that it returns a certain data type. But then within Jenkins, because it's mostly freestyle, there are many ways that you can work, but one of them being a freestyle project, maybe a unit test is that when I deploy my server, that server has availability to connect to these IPs and ports, and it needs to within the VPC or within the DMZ that it's deployed as well. And then because of that, I can then report that back to something like GitHub that says, as soon as I deploy it, if that fails, I now have that visibility and that transparency to say, hey, you know what, this has failed from a server standpoint. Perhaps we should work with the engineering folks to make sure that they know about it as well.
Nice. I should share with the audience that the development of the Big IP GitHub integration has evolved somewhat from chats with Christian and his experience in some of these other areas, especially like some of that unit testing, et cetera, those kind of things. I mean, there are so many cool processes that come from software engineering world that if we apply them to the way we run infrastructure, life is so much easier. It's easier to support. It's easier to troubleshoot. There's less risk at the time I hit that magic deploy button because I know about what's going on. I know what's been validated. I can build workflows into the process instead of just this finite pasting into a putty session and crossing my fingers. Like, we just don't do that anymore once we adopt things like infrastructure as code. Like, things are much simpler and much more robust.
Exactly. And I think one of the common misconceptions that you get from infrastructure folks, or some of the FUD that you get from that, is infrastructure as code sounds great, but why would I want to use Git if it's not going to be an SCA tool that's stuck around, right? And a lot of time, or that's not going to stick around. You know, what prevents me from doing this if it's going to be replaced in 4 or 5 years out in the future by something else? And you know, my answer to that is, I think, you know, in terms of source code management, Git itself has won the war. You know, I've been with GitHub for about 3 years, but I've been a user since 2010, right? And if we think about where Git was in 2005, I think, you know, it has become the eponymous standard for which software development is done. And I don't see anything changing in the near future or in the future itself, not only from a Git standpoint, but in terms of how GitHub is going to be in the market for software developers. I don't see anything from that core workflow process changing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Now, for the people who are coming to F5 Agility, you mentioned that earlier. You and I are giving a talk on exactly this practice. So if you're coming to F5 Agility in Boston, which is, I've had to bring it up on another window because I forget. It's very soon. August 13th to 16th, which is F5's customer conference. Christian and I are going to get up there and speak about it, run some live demos, because that's what crazy people do, and actually show how this product process works, how it's very safe, how it's easy to roll back, how it's easy to put in what I refer to as BDN, bureaucracy-driven networking. If you want approve buttons and all that stuff, we can show you how to bake all that into the process as well. So by all means, look out for the Super-NetOps configuration as code session and come say hi. In addition to, we will both be manning the GitHub booth within the Solutions Expo to take any further questions. So come say hi. We'd really appreciate that. You can learn more from Christian and myself. But we're kind of running out of time there. Any closing kind of comments for people who maybe have always just been in network operations, Christian? Like, why should they jump in and give this a go? I mean, is there any key kind of thing you tell people who are uncertain where to start or how to begin?
Yes, if you've never taken like a course in source code management, look at Git itself. Look at the Git tutorials that are available online. GitHub has got some great ones that'll just kind of get you into that mindset of what it actually means to treat things as code, and go through like the non-technical tutorials. We have a series of free training on GitHub called GitHub for Non-Developers. So take a look at that, and that kind of gets you in the process of even treating like raw, like text documents like code, and how I would be able to see like change management through that. I think that's fantastic. And the second thing I'll close on is, I think you bring up a really a good term there. It's BDN, bureaucracy-driven networking. And the way that I like to describe it when I'm giving demos and I'm talking to customers out in the field is, I think, you know, when we're giving demos, we always show the perfect world scenario where, you know, we merge code in and it gets automatically deployed and delivered all out and everything's rosy. But, you know, coming from the operations and the infrastructure side, even though I've spent the last 3 years in non-production systems giving the perfect world, showing what that real world scenario is like with approval gates and showing what it looks like to still have that sort of manual sign off is more important than anything, because, you know, we're not necessarily going to get into not every organization is going to have a maturity model that's built around 100% automation. But if I can automate 20 to 30% of my day, that still saves me so much in terms of not only what I can contribute to that organization, but if I'm also an IT director or an IT manager, that's just saved labor that I can allocate elsewhere.
Fantastic advice. And yes, I always forget to point people to that. The free online training, you don't need to jump straight into managing your infrastructure to see the value in this. I mean, even documentation. In fact, a lot of people who have asked me where they should start, I tell them, you know what, document your environment and do it in code repositories. And that's a great, very safe way to get really familiar. I actually do my blogging in a repo in Markdown and have a pipeline that spits out fancy HTML in the end, because it's easier for me. I can blog from anything, anywhere, and it's safe. It's all stored in my repository. So yeah, that's a great place to begin, definitely. So we're going to wrap up there. Sorry,
Sounds
Chris?
great. Oh, I was gonna say, not to bike shed, one last thing that just made me think of something. We actually do all of our legal review in GitHub as well. So not only are you doing blogging, we're doing our legal review in there as well. So
there you go. It solves everything. World peace, solves a lot. It's all good. Well, on that note, yeah, thanks for listening, Christian. Thanks so much for coming on and just sharing your insights there. Really appreciate that. And I guess I'll see you very soon in Boston.
Yep, and if you mention that you watch this webinar at F5, I'll have some special stickers for you at the Agility conference. So,
that's great. Okay, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for joining us, Christian, and have a fantastic day doing your GitHub tutorials. Thanks for listening.
Sounds
Bye.
good. Thank you so much.